It was catalogued simply as 1903, Foundlings Day, Philadelphia, a routine record, one among hundreds of charity photographs kept in the city's archive, filed between pages that smelled of mildew and paper rot. Most visitors passed by without stopping. The image looked ordinary at first glance, quiet, almost tender. But for the ones who stood long enough, who let the silence of the photograph fill the air, something different began to surface. The kind of detail that doesn't belong to coincidence. The picture showed 4 infants in wicker bassinets, lying side by side atop a long table draped in linen. Their faces were calm, motionless, captured mid-breath, as if the camera had paused time rather than stolen it. The light came through 2 tall frosted windows, bathing the scene in a haze of dust and grace. In the background stood 2 nuns, veiled, still nearly spectral, their habits blending into the cracked plaster walls. But the light didn't rest on them. It lingered on the smallest details. The tags tied to each baby's wrist. 3 bore the same graphite handwriting, Philadelphia County Home. The 4th, on the far left, had something else, a name that didn't belong here, a city written with the same trembling hand, St. Louis. The discovery wasn't made until more than a century later, when the archivist who found it, a woman named Margaret Vale, was restoring a collection of damaged prints for a museum exhibit titled Mercy and Memory. She'd been working alone that night, the rain soft against the high windows, her desk lamp burning low. The photo was one of dozens she'd cleaned and cataloged, brushing away dust with the care one gives to relics of faith. But when she tilted it toward the light, the corner tag caught her eye. She adjusted her glasses, leaned closer. At first, she thought it was a smudge, graphite that had bled or faded, but under the magnifying glass, the word sharpened into focus, its curves clear and deliberate. St. Louis. Margaret frowned. St. Louis? It made no sense. Foundlings Day had been a local charity event, an annual gathering where orphanages displayed the children they cared for, a gesture of transparency to the city's donors and churches. The records from that day listed only one institution, the Sisters of the Holy Providence, Philadelphia. There was no mention of any child transferred from another city. She turned the photo over. On the back, faint handwriting appeared in graphite, faded by age, but still legible. Taken by J.W. Fenton, 1903, for the Board of Public Welfare. A standard note, nothing unusual. But beneath it, faint and half erased, a second line, tag 4, mislabeled, remove before printing. Margaret's hand froze. It had not been removed. She sat back, the leather of her chair creaking softly. The image stared up at her, its century-old silence filling the room. There was something about the baby on the left, the one with the foreign tag. Its body was turned slightly, angled away from the others. The light touched its face differently, tracing the hollow curve of its cheek, the small indent at the base of its chin. Its eyes were closed, but not peacefully. The lids seemed to press down against something, as if even in that frozen instant, the child had felt the weight of being misplaced. She thought of the note again. Remove before printing. It meant the photographer had noticed. Someone had tried to erase the mistake. But what if it hadn't been a mistake? Outside, thunder cracked over the city, long and low. The archives trembled faintly, windows rattling against the wind. Margaret reached to steady the photo, her fingertips brushing the paper's uneven surface, the delicate cracks in the emulsion, the soft warping near the edges. It felt alive, almost pulsing beneath her skin. She turned on the desk lamp, drawing it closer. The golden light revealed the photograph's texture. Every scratch, every fingerprint, every faint chemical bloom from a life spent in the dark. It was a simple picture. 4 children, 2 nuns, 1 table, and yet, the longer she stared, the more she saw the quiet disorder beneath its symmetry. The child tagged St. Louis lay on the left, but the shadow under its bassinet leaned in the opposite direction, toward the others. A subtle impossibility. In photographs of that era, shadows told the truth. Light couldn't lie, not in glass negatives, not in silver nitrate, but this one did. She leaned closer, squinting through her magnifier. The shadow wasn't just wrong, it was layered, faintly doubled, as if something had shifted during exposure, or as if the child had been placed there after the photograph had already begun. Margaret took a deep breath, exhaling slowly through her nose. Her pulse felt heavy, irregular. She had seen 1,000 images like this. Hospitals, orphanages, workhouses, each one steeped in the quiet suffering of another century. But this was different. This felt deliberate. She noted it in her journal. 1903, Foundlings Day photograph. 4 subjects, 1 foreign tag, possible multiple exposure, note on verso, remove before printing. Why not obeyed? She paused, pen hovering over the page. Then, almost as an afterthought, she wrote one more line. Perhaps the wrong child was removed. That night she printed an enlargement, carefully, using soft light to preserve the tonal range. When the image emerged from the developer tray, She could see details the original had hidden, the faint stitching of the linen cloth, the small fold in the second infant's blanket, and there, almost invisible, the reflection of someone standing behind the nuns, not the photographer, too tall, too still. A man, or the suggestion of one, his figure blurred at the edges like smoke. She stared until her eyes burned. When she blinked, the figure was gone. She turned off the lamp. The room dimmed to shadow. The only sound was the steady ticking of the wall clock and the rain outside. And somewhere within that rhythm, beneath the hush of thunder and paper, she heard something small, almost like the sigh of air escaping from behind glass. She looked down. The photograph had shifted. One of the bassinets was slightly out of line. For a moment, she didn't breathe. Her hands trembled as she reached to adjust the frame, her fingertips brushing the cracked border. The paper was cool, softer than it should have been for its age. Her thumb grazed the ink notation on the back, remove before printing, and faintly beneath it, a new mark she hadn't noticed before, pressed into the fiber rather than written on top. One word, barely visible under angled light: return. She sat there long after the lights went out, her reflection flickering in the glass of the archive window. Behind her, the city slept. In front of her, 4 infants lay frozen in a photograph that had never belonged entirely to this world. The rain tapped softly on the glass, and for a fleeting moment she could almost hear another sound beneath it, a heartbeat, faint and far away, echoing through the decades. The tag had said St. Louis, but the photograph had been taken in Philadelphia. Somewhere across the miles, another infant had worn the same name and the same number. Morning arrived gray and heavy. The rain had stopped, but the city felt waterlogged, as though every brick still remembered the night's thunder. Margaret walked the narrow corridor of the historical records office with a cup of coffee cooling in her hand, her mind still circling the photograph. She had seen duplications before, clerical errors, misprints, accidents of bureaucracy, but this felt different. It wasn't just the tag that troubled her, it was the way the entire image seemed aware of its mistake, as if even the light had hesitated when it touched the wrong name. She found herself back at her desk, the photograph resting in its folder under glass. It looked harmless again, the kind of relic tourists overlook behind museum glass. Yet the longer she stared, the more the silence inside it seemed to lean toward her, patient, expectant. She opened her notebook. The words from the night before were still fresh. Perhaps the wrong child was removed. She added another line beneath it, or perhaps both were never meant to exist apart. The city records were incomplete. The turn of the century had been careless with memory. Floods, fires, recataloguing, and neglect had eaten through decades of documentation. Still, she knew where to look. The Board of Public Welfare had merged with the Department of Health in 1912. If the infants in the photograph were part of an official charity event, their names, or numbers, would have been recorded somewhere. The archives were housed in the old municipal courthouse, a red brick building that leaned slightly as if tired of standing. The air inside was cold and dry, filled with the faint scent of iron ink and dust. She showed her credentials to the clerk, who nodded absently and led her down to the sub-basement where entire lifetimes were stacked in boxes marked Philadelphia County Home, 1899-1905. She spent hours opening them. Inside were folders with brittle pages, reports written in looping cursive, and thin photographs pressed between glassine sheets. She scanned them mechanically. Names, dates, initials. Most of the records were of infants who had died before their first birthday, casualties of malnutrition, fever, or anonymity. Then, near the bottom of one folder marked 1903, Foundlings Day Submissions, she found it. Entry number 47. Male infant, approximate age 6 months. Tag marked Philadelphia County Home. Admitted for public display June 1st, 1903. Baptized and listed as Elias P. Her eyes caught on the second page. Transferred July 2nd, 1903 to St. Phime, Louis Mercy Refuge under order of Reverend G. Hanley. She froze. Her breath hitched. The St. Louis tag hadn't been an error. She took out her phone and began cross-referencing the name St. Louis Mercy Refuge. The results were sparse. A Catholic orphanage founded in 1898, closed after a fire in 1904. Only a handful of records survived, but in a digitized ledger, she found an entry dated June 1st, 1903, the same day as Philadelphia's Foundlings Day. Infant male received from Philadelphia County Home, Elias P.O., baptism duplicate, record disputed, duplicate. She scrolled further. There was another entry immediately beneath it. Infant male, name unknown, same date, same baptismal record number, removed prior to census. Removed. Her pulse began to thrum. She read the lines again, her eyes tracing the faint handwriting that had somehow survived the century. 2 infants, same identification, one transferred, one erased. But who decided which was which? Margaret leaned back, staring at the dim ceiling of the archive room. Somewhere above, pipes hissed quietly. She rubbed her temples, trying to reason with the impossible. Maybe the records were misfiled. Maybe the transfer order had been copied wrong. But the handwriting, the graphite in the photograph, the ink in the ledger, it matched. She knew it even before comparing them. The same careful slant, the same faint tremor at the end of each line, the same hand. She pulled the original photo from its sleeve again and turned it under the light. The graphite on the tag gleamed faintly. The letters of St. Louis curved exactly the way they had on the transfer record. It wasn't an error. It was intent. Someone had rewritten the child's origin. By dusk, her office was filled with papers, copies of records, photographs, old correspondence. Her desk looked like an altar to lost names. She had learned more about the two institutions than she wanted to. Both Catholic-run, both funded by the same charitable network, both overseen by the same priest, Reverend Gregory Hanley. Hanley had been a controversial figure in his time. His name appeared in reports about unauthorized baptisms and the reallocation of wards. In plain words, it meant that children were sometimes reassigned between homes, their identities rewritten for accounting, for faith, for mercy. But one particular report caught her attention, dated 1905, a disciplinary note written after the St. Louis fire. Records indicate that Reverend Hanley continued the practice of mirrored identification, assigning two children the same name and number for financial and administrative purposes. The church has condemned this as grave misconduct. Outcome: dismissal. Mirrored identification. Two children, one identity. Margaret sat very still. The thought made her stomach twist. She looked again at the photograph. 4 bassinets, 4 infants. What if one of them didn't belong to the world of the living at all? What if the camera had caught both sides of the same soul? She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "That's absurd," she whispered. "It's just an administrative ghost." But even as she said it, she glanced at the photograph again, and for the briefest instant, the light shifted. The smallest infant, the one tagged St. Louis, seemed to shimmer, as if its outline pulsed faintly beneath the layer of emulsion. The illusion vanished when she blinked, but her pulse didn't slow. That night, unable to sleep, she went back to the photograph with a magnifying lens. The shadows beneath the bassinets were deep, soft, and consistent, except under the first child. There the grain was finer, as though part of the image had been retouched long ago. And hidden in that dark patch of shadow, she noticed it, a faint graphite line thinner than a hair curving into a letter. Not S, not L, just a fragment of a word. She tilted the light. The line sharpened. It read, twice. She took a step back, her chair scraping softly against the floor. Her heartbeat filled the silence. The records had said it plainly. Mirrored identification, duplicate baptism. Two children carrying the same name, born of the same act of mercy. And here in this photograph, that mercy had taken shape. The camera hadn't caught an error. It had caught the moment reality split in two. She sat at her desk until dawn, her lamp burning low, the air thick with the scent of dust and silver. When the sun rose, it painted the city in the same dull gold that filled the photograph. Margaret's reflection stared back at her from the glass frame, tired, pale, her eyes hollow from sleeplessness. But behind her reflection, she could almost see the faint curve of another face, smaller, softer, watching. And though she told herself it was only the play of light, she still turned the photograph face down. It took Margaret 2 days to find the last surviving records of the St. Louis Mercy Refuge. They weren't kept by the city or by the diocese. They were buried in the basement of a small historical society run by volunteers, a forgotten annex of memory sitting beneath a shuttered library. The curator, a frail woman with tremoring hands named Edith Malone, met her at the door. Her voice was quiet, the kind that sounds like it comes from a place that hasn't spoken in a while. "Most of our papers didn't survive the fire," she said, leading Margaret down a narrow staircase lit by a single flickering bulb. "But the photographs did. We found them sealed in a wooden chest, wrapped in damp linen. They must have been stored by someone who cared enough to keep them dry." The air smelled of mold and dust, the kind that clings to skin. At the far end of the basement stood a long table. On it, beneath sheets of glass, were the surviving prints, about 20 in total. And there, halfway down the line, she saw it. A photograph almost identical to the one from Philadelphia. 4 infants, 4 bassinets, the same table, the same light. But this time, the tag on the far right child read, Philadelphia County Home. Margaret felt the world tilt slightly, like the floor had shifted under her. She bent closer, her eyes tracing the details with slow, trembling focus. It was the same setup, same window, same plaster cracks on the wall, even the same faint chalkboard with the blurred numbers. But the children weren't identical. The arrangement was reversed, mirrored as if through glass. The nuns were different too, one tall, one short, their habits darker, their faces more sharply defined. And in the space between the bassinets, where shadows should have fallen evenly, there was a faint vertical streak, a narrow column of light that seemed to connect both photographs, like a fracture running through time. Her heart beat hard in her chest. She reached out and touched the edge of the print through the glass. The paper looked older than the one she had, more brittle, more fragile. The sepia tone nearly dissolved into pale amber, and yet, despite its age, the ink on the back was clear. It read, St. Louis Mercy Refuge, June 1st, 1903. Commissioned by Reverend G. Hanley for the Day of Providence. Margaret turned toward Edith, her voice barely steady. Who developed these? Edith blinked, surprised. We don't know. The negatives were lost in the fire. These are all we have. But look at this. She pulled out another envelope from the same box. It contained a handwritten note, dated decades later, signed only with initials. Both prints were made from the same glass plate. Exposure doubled by accident or intent. The fourth child appears twice. It is not an error. It is preservation. Margaret sat down heavily, the chair creaking beneath her. Her fingertips brushed the paper. The fourth child appears twice. Her mind returned to the word she'd seen under the shadow in the first photograph. Twice. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. She looked up at the mirrored photo again. In the Philadelphia image, the St. Louis tag had been misplaced. Here, the opposite had happened. The same name, two places, the same light, two exposures, one memory stretched across distance, refusing to break. Later that evening, as the last rays of the setting sun cut through the narrow basement window, she photographed both images side by side under equal light. When she compared them on her screen, something impossible happened. When placed together, one inverted, the other reversed, the two photographs aligned perfectly. Every detail matched. The tablecloth fold, the curve of the bassinets, the placement of the chalkboard, even the faint shadow of the tripod leg. But when she overlaid them completely, blending the opacity, a new figure appeared in the center, a faint outline of a woman holding something small, her body facing neither side but somewhere in between, a bridge between two worlds. Margaret froze, her breath shallow. She zoomed in. The figure's face was indistinct, almost erased by time, but around her neck, barely visible, hung a silver cross, the same one she'd seen in the Philadelphia image, worn by one of the nuns, Sister Agnes. It wasn't just her handwriting that linked the two homes, where it was her presence. She had been in both photographs, but how? The time, the date, the exposure, all were simultaneous. And yet she appeared in two places at once, just like the child she'd tried to protect. Margaret's thoughts began to spiral. Had Sister Agnes taken both photographs herself? Had she carried the same glass plate between cities? Or had she used the camera for something else? A confession in light? A prayer in silver? Her hands trembled as she printed the overlaid image. The faint outline of the woman seemed to glow, her face dissolving into shadow, her arms bent in a gesture both of holding and of release. When the print dried, Margaret turned off the lamp and stared at it under the dim light of her phone. The photograph shimmered faintly, the silver salts catching what little light remained. And in that moment, she heard it, not with her ears, but somewhere inside her chest, where memory and fear met. A sound like a sigh, a word like forgiven. She stumbled back, her chair toppling. The sound echoed longer than it should have, swallowed by the basement's low ceiling. When she looked again, the print had changed. The face of the woman was gone, but the faint beam of light between the bassinets was now brighter, no longer a fracture but a connection. It stretched from one infant's tag to another's, from St. Louis to Philadelphia. One name, two cities, one child, two lives. When she finally left the archive that night, the air outside felt wrong, too quiet, too clean, as if something had been lifted from the world and replaced by silence. The streetlights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang 12 times. Margaret walked until she reached the small hotel where she was staying. She locked the door behind her and sat on the bed, both prints spread out before her. Under the warm lamplight, they seemed almost alive, silvered ghosts of each other breathing in sync. And as she watched, something began to happen again. The St. Louis print darkened at the edges, the shadows deepening until the outline of a hand appeared. Small, almost translucent, pressing from within the paper as if against glass. The touch was gentle, almost tender, a gesture not of fear, but recognition. Margaret reached forward, her fingertips hovering above the image. The air around her thickened. The smell of old chemicals, of dust and milk and incense filled the room. And from somewhere beyond the reach of reason, a voice spoke, faint, like a whisper through walls. They were never apart. She sat there, motionless, the tears she hadn't noticed gathering at the corner of her eyes. The two photographs trembled slightly in the current of air from the vent. For a brief, impossible moment, they aligned again, and the world felt whole. Then the light flickered out. The next morning, the world seemed smaller. Margaret woke before dawn, her hands still stained faintly with the scent of photo developer and candle smoke. She had dreamed of the photograph again, not as paper and light, but as a place she could enter. In the dream, she had walked into the charity hall in Philadelphia, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The bassinets were empty, but the air still held the warmth of something that had just left. And on the table where the children had lain, a single camera waited, its lens open, reflecting the faint shimmer of a candle flame. When she opened her eyes, the real camera sat on her desk, her own, digital and cold, but for a fleeting instant, she felt the same pull, as if something were watching her through it, quietly waiting to be seen again. She dressed quickly and returned to the St. Louis archive. Edith greeted her with surprise, the kind reserved for someone who hasn't yet learned how to leave the past behind. "You're back already? I think I missed something," Margaret said softly. "A message, maybe?" Edith nodded slowly. "Then it's waiting for you in the last box." The words made no sense, but she didn't question them. Down in the basement again, Margaret found a narrow wooden crate she hadn't noticed before. The lid was marked SM 1904. Inside were water-damaged letters, blackened at the edges, tied with faded blue ribbon. The handwriting was unmistakable, thin, deliberate, trembling slightly at the ends. "Sister Agnes." She untied the ribbon carefully. The top page was nearly illegible, but the signature below it was intact. She unfolded the paper and began to read. "June 1903, the day of Providence. I was ordered to take the photograph twice, once in Philadelphia, once in St. Louis. Father Hanley said it was to prove the children's care, to please the donors, to show that mercy had no border, but I knew the truth before he said it. The number had been repeated, the record had been mirrored. 2 infants carried one name. One would stay, one would be sent away, so that both homes might claim God's blessing for their charity. He said I must choose which would bear the number, and which would be rewritten. He called it accounting. I called it crucifixion. The first child was sickly, quiet, pale as the cloth around him. The second, restless, stronger. But when I held them both, I felt no difference. I felt only the same heartbeat, split between 2 bodies. So I took both photographs with the same plate, in the same light, under the same prayer. I turned the plate halfway between them, and in doing so, I believed I had given them back to each other. If this act is sin, let it be mine. For mercy should not divide, not children, not memory, not love." Margaret's eyes blurred as she read. Her hands trembled, the old ink smudging faintly against her fingertips. She turned to the next page. "After the fire, they said the records were gone, but the light remembers, the glass remembers, and those who look long enough will see." Below the writing there was a faint outline, a traced symbol drawn by hand, 2 small circles intersecting. In the center, the number 4, the number of the infants in the photo. But it wasn't arithmetic, it was communion. Margaret leaned back against the wall. Her chest felt tight, as though she'd been holding her breath for a century she didn't live through. The confession was not just a story, it was an act of rebellion, a woman breaking the silence of faith to preserve something purer than obedience. Sister Agnes hadn't tried to deceive the church, she'd tried to save the truth. The 2 photographs were not errors, they were an attempt to heal a wound that God himself had refused to touch. She placed the letter beside the St. Louis photograph and looked at them together under the flickering basement light. The lines of the 2 prints met perfectly, the fractures aligning, the shadows completing each other. Where one photo darkened, the other shone. When she overlaid them once more, the faint beam of light between the bassinets grew brighter, the ghost of Sister Agnes forming again between them. But this time, the woman's head was bowed, her hands raised not in sorrow but in offering. The exposure trembled, the silver catching the air like breath. For a moment, Margaret felt as though the past had begun to move, not forward but inward. She whispered, "You joined them." And in that instant, the image shimmered, the faint outline of a baby's hand pressed against the glass. Not desperate, not lost, simply present. She stood there for a long time, her mind quiet, her heart heavy with the impossible beauty of it. The woman who had broken her vows to keep love whole, the children who had been split in name but not in soul, the camera that had become both confessional and crucifix. She understood then that the photographs were not proof of what happened. They were what was meant to happen, a correction made in light, a redemption written in silver. The world had called it sin, but God perhaps had called it remembrance. When she finally left the basement, the early light of morning had returned. pale and trembling through the dirty windows. She stepped outside into the cool air and felt something she hadn't felt in days. Stillness, the kind that follows understanding, the kind that feels like the pause between confession and forgiveness. She turned the letter over one last time before tucking it into her bag. On the back, written in faint pencil, were the final words of Sister Agnes: "Light does not forgive, it reveals." That night, back in her small apartment, Margaret placed the two photographs side by side under her desk lamp. The air around her seemed charged, electric but calm. She spoke softly, though there was no one to hear her. "I understand now. You weren't hiding them from God. You were showing him what he'd missed." She lifted the glass from one of the frames. The scent of old paper filled the air. When she tilted it, the reflection of the two images overlapped again, and for a fleeting moment, the light between them became something whole. Not memory, not faith, just mercy. By the end of the week, Margaret had returned the photographs to the museum. They were cleaned, flattened, catalogued, their new digital scans perfectly preserved, their data assigned, their ghosts archived. To anyone else, they were simply relics, two fragile prints, a few sentences of metadata, a historical footnote filed under early 20th century orphanages, religious institutions, 1903, 1904. But Margaret knew better. She had held their silence. She had heard their breathing. And she knew that mercy, once captured, never really stopped moving. It was raining again, softly, steadily, as it always seemed to when the past stirred. She stood in the museum's restoration lab, watching droplets run down the glass panes. The photographs lay on the table in front of her, still faintly silvered from age, the smallest traces of light flickering across their surfaces. Beside them rested Sister Agnes's letter, sealed now in archival plastic, its words safe but unreadable. Margaret smiled faintly. Some confessions weren't meant to be translated. They were meant to stay between the soul and the silence that listened. She adjusted the lamp above the prints. The soft, diffused light swept gently across the table, touching each child's face. The details glowed: the curve of the bassinets, the texture of linen, the faint reflection of window panes behind the nuns. But it was the space between the bassinets that caught her eye. The sliver of shadow that had once divided the children now shimmered faintly, its darkness laced with light, like two photographs finally learning how to share the same breath. She remembered what the letter had said: "Light does not forgive, it reveals." For the first time she understood. Forgiveness was not about forgetting, it was about remembering without fear. She leaned closer. The reflection of her own face appeared on the glass, superimposed over the infant's, her eyes hovering above theirs. For a brief moment, she thought she saw someone else reflected there too, a woman in a black habit, her hands folded calmly over her heart. Sister Agnes, or perhaps only the light remembering her shape. Either way, Margaret didn't flinch. She only whispered, "They're safe now." The reflection smiled back. And then, as the overhead lamp flickered, the figure was gone. That evening, as the museum closed and the halls dimmed to silence, the photographs remained under soft preservation light. The security cameras caught nothing unusual, only the faint shift of shadows, the hum of fluorescent bulbs. But one guard walking past the restoration lab stopped for a moment and frowned. The light above the photographs had begun to pulse slowly, not flickering but breathing. He stepped closer, curious. The prints were still, perfectly framed. Yet when he leaned down, he could swear he saw a change. The faint beam of light that ran through the center of both images, that delicate connection between the bassinets, had grown stronger. It stretched not as a shadow anymore, but as a thread of pure silver light, binding the children together in one continuous glow. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and stepped back. The glow faded, leaving only sepia and silence. The next morning, when Margaret returned, she found something she couldn't explain. On the glass surface above the photographs, faint condensation had formed overnight, not random, but deliberate, shaped by the warmth of something unseen. Two small handprints, side by side. They were tiny, symmetrical, pressed as if from within, and between them, a single word traced in the faintest curve of moisture: together. Margaret didn't call anyone. She didn't document it. She simply stood there, smiling through quiet tears, letting the air dry the message back into invisibility. When it was gone, she placed her hand gently over the glass, not to capture the warmth, but to leave some of her own. Then she turned off the light. The reflection of the city glowed faintly in the window. Beyond it, the rain began again, falling softly, endlessly, like memory learning how to rest. Later that day, a new exhibit label was added to the collection. No one knew who wrote it. It read simply, 1903, Philadelphia and St. Louis Foundlings Day, photographs, two exposures, one act of mercy. The same light remembers both. And if you stand before those photographs long enough, when the museum is quiet and the air is heavy with dust and stillness, you might see it too. A faint shimmer between the bassinets, a light that moves though nothing in the room has changed. It doesn't fade when you look away, it only waits. Valeside Stories, where every photograph remembers the hands that held it. If this story reached you, subscribe to Valeside Stories, for the light still has more to show.